Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the late start. We had a little bit of a struggle getting into the studio, but you are live with us today. We're on Evidence of Design on 100.9 WXIR. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host today, Mary Lawrence. I'm covering the show while Jason and Matt are out of town, so thanks again for joining us. And we are in studio live for you today, so you can actually call in, despite what Jason was saying in the recording before. You can call us anytime during the show, 585-219-8889. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Radio EOD. You can send us an email to radioeod@gmail.com. And you can find our past episodes on YouTube by searching Evidence of Design. So, I am joined in the studio today by a very special guest, Samantha Shipek. Samantha has joined us on air once before, last summer. She was on to discuss media and disinformation. This was back when I was also still only a guest on the show. And today she's back, and we're looking forward to discussing literacy, language learning, and language acquisition, and how access to language can allow us to access resources. And in that vein, how a lack of access or a lack of language can limit that access. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining today. Want to say hello?
Sure. Thanks very much for the welcome, Mary. As Mary said, my name's Samantha, and I'm a language teacher. Right now I'm a middle school teacher, but I've taught middle and high school. And today we'd like to reflect a bit on literacy and what it means to be literate and who has access to literacy and how it's valued in schools and in general. So, Mary, to start off, I have a question for you.
Oh boy.
You, like I, though actually probably more than I am, are multilingual. So my question for you is, when did you become literate in any of your languages?
In any languages. So I guess if we're thinking of literacy as what? Realizing that we can read or communicate, I think
Let's go with, just for the purpose of consistency, let's go with reading and writing maybe. Or let's focus on reading. It's just a good reading to start.
That's good, because that's where I was going to go, actually. So my very first memory in English, so as Sam mentioned, I am multilingual, so I do speak English, French, and German. English is my native language, and it's the one I've spoken and written and read in for the longest. And my first memory of being really able on my own to read in English was when I was 4 years old. My family had a stack of children's books lined up in our bathroom, which, as a note, is a great place to keep a large stack of quick reading. And I remember we used to read them together. I'd read them with my parents and siblings. And one day I just wandered into the bathroom and just pulled down a book from the shelf. It was Go Dog Go, and I read the entire book from beginning to end with no assistance. And I think that was the first time, or at least the first time in my memory, that I read a book on my own without any help. And it's still a very special book for that reason.
Do you still have the book?
I think it's at my parents' house.
And speaking of your parents, actually, so you said that your siblings, you have multiple older siblings, and your parents would read as well. Did they read to you? Did you have a reading schedule in your family?
I don't know so much about a reading schedule. They read
routine,
to me a lot. Well, we definitely read before bed every night. And my family, I grew up Catholic, and so my dad would read to me from the Bible pretty often. But we also read a lot of children's stories and various stories. When I was really little, we had a study, which is now having 3 older siblings, it eventually got turned into a bedroom as we got older. But it was a study with a desk and a couch. And so we would always snuggle on this 2-seat couch, and there would be a few of us snuggled around there. And we would read together. I don't think we have that couch anymore, but it got beat up by everyone sitting on the arms. But so that's just for my native language. But I guess, how about you? Do you remember when you were first able to read or write in English?
I don't. I vaguely remember reading a Bug's Life novel at one point.
I didn't know there were novels of that.
Yeah, it's like a retelling of the story, or maybe it's an extra story. I don't actually remember that clearly. I remember seeing it at a family friend's house and saying, oh, I read this book, and having this memory. I was probably, I don't know, I don't want to say an age because then I'd have to think about when did A Bug's Life come out. But I think I was also kindergarten age or younger. I was definitely reading before that, but that's one of the earlier books I remember thinking about or recognizing like as an accomplishment. Mm-hmm. But I was asking a bit about your family's literacy habits, just because that's something we might touch on a little bit later. What kind of exposure to reading did you have at home? Mm-hmm. I mean, we could talk about that for who has access to literacy materials like reading books, and who has the time to be at home with their families.
Yeah, time is certainly a thing. I mean, both of my parents worked, but very consistent. You know, it was like a consistent schedule. My mom was a teacher, and so she worked while we were at school at the same time. And my dad was a librarian, and he worked some nights, but it was like only ever 2 nights a week and never more. And so most of the time he was also there and available for us to ask questions, to read. And again, I mean, just thinking of those two professions, both of them are very focused quite obviously on literacy.
Right.
And, I mean, yesterday when we were talking about this, I remember you joking like, oh, hey, you remember, you know, when you were little, your parents probably read to you, but they didn't pull out grammar books and say like, hey, this is, you know, this is like this form. And my parents may have actually done that, but I know that's not normal.
True. Okay. So then speaking, we're foreshadowing a little bit our talk about language acquisition and learning. So what about in your other languages? When did you feel that you became literate? Or when is your memory of literacy?
So you would think this would be easier because they're both more recent. I started learning, well, I guess I have two different experiences with the two languages I speak. I grew up very close to the Canadian border, so French was always something that I had access to in a different way than I later learned German. Like we had French radio stations, we had French TV. One of my good friends is French speaking, so I was surrounded by it a lot, even though I didn't understand it. And then when I started learning more officially in 8th grade, when I started taking French in middle school, it became something, I'm trying to think of how, I guess, it became something, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I guess it felt more familiar already because I had some exposure. So there was already sort of a rhythm in my head and already a flow, but
So it was more comprehensible to you faster, you think?
Then
because it wasn't maybe as much of an othering thing, like it was something that was distant?
I think so. Like when I learned German, it was kind of just like I started in a classroom. I didn't really have any exposure to it before that. For French, it was more like, I think, we'll get into this. It was more acquisition, and then learning. But I think the memory that jumps out to me most, so I was an exchange student in high school in a French-speaking country. I lived in Belgium for a year with a host family. And I remember one moment, I had been trying to get my host sister to tell me how to say, like, I mean this. And she, like, the translation didn't make sense to me. So she told me what it was, and it's je veux dire, which literally means, like, I want to say. And I was like, no, that's not the same thing. And I remember we were at an exhibition on a field trip, and I saw on a wall there was a quotation that had like je veux dire something in it, and in my head I understood it as I mean, and I remember like just reading it and getting it, and then I was like, wait a second, that's what that is, that's what that means, you know. And that's not exactly the same thing as like, you know, reading a book from cover to cover, but it was like just this real understanding, this comprehension of like, oh, I get it, you know?
Right, and I think also probably, again, we'll talk in a second about the difference between language acquisition and learning, but had you encountered that particular translation in a vocabulary list, it might have not had that same connection. You might have thought, okay, this is the structure that corresponds to the idea that I'm trying to express. To mean to say something is kind of like to want to say. You know? I'm thinking of the German to wonder. Ich frage mich.
Yeah.
I wonder. I ask myself exactly like, allowing for some nuance in that translation, but you comprehended that. I mean, you read it and it made meaning to you that was also meaningful. So I think that's a legitimate answer. Not that you need my
well, I appreciate that.
Approval. Okay, speaking of German.
Oh yeah, I guess you asked me about both of them. I was trying to think of German. Like I said, this was a little bit of a different experience than learning French. Because when I started learning German, I was actually in my exchange year in Belgium. So for one thing, I learned German from the ground up in a different language. So I was learning in French, which I already hadn't mastered.
Right.
So that was a challenge in itself. And I think when I was thinking about when I acquired this language, it was actually also with reading a book. So I kind of think of my German literacy moment as the first time that I actually was able to read an entire book without using a dictionary. And it didn't mean necessarily I didn't understand every word, far from it, but I understood the story and I understood the general thought process that was going into the story. Just as a fun note, it was Die Judenbuche by Annette von Droste-Hülshoff. It's a book that I read in college, and I think it was my junior or senior year of college. So at the time, it was after 4 or 5 years of German language instruction and having lived in Berlin for just a semester, but still for some period of time. But how about with you?
So my other two languages are Russian and German, and I would say that I never fulfilled my goal of becoming literate in Russian. I learned Russian. I wanted to learn, not yet, haven't yet. I wanted to learn to read Russian, actually. And I ended up gaining conversational proficiency, but not reading. Yeah, that didn't happen yet, so is yet to come. But for German, I don't really remember an earlier moment. I think for me, the accomplishment that made sense for me as being, okay, I can read this and understand it even though I don't know all of the words, is in my 4th year of German study, I borrowed Brecht's Drei Groschen Oper, the 3-penny opera, and just sat down and read it for fun.
You read that for fun?
Yeah.
Just like, okay.
When I went in my senior year of high school, and that was definitely above my reading level. I was in an AP course and we read The Never-Ending Story in German, part of it, with annotation from my teacher that supported the language that we didn't have. But there was that element of like, I'm trying this by myself and I don't need to understand every word. This was after I had had a 3-week experience in Germany, the summer beforehand. But should we talk now a bit about language acquisition and learning?
I think so. But first, before we get into that, I would like to remind our listeners that you are listening to 100.9 WXIR in Rochester, New York. We are live for you in the studio right now, so you can call us if you want to join this conversation. The phone number is 585-219-8889. And I also want to just give a shout out. There is, WXIR is involved today in a Juneteenth celebration. It's happening right now at Martin Luther King Park. And Juneteenth is a commemoration of slavery ending in the United States. So it's a very exciting time. There's a parade. There's going to be a libation ceremony at 12:15 and musical guests all afternoon. So if you can make it over there, I don't think it's supposed to rain until later this afternoon. So definitely go check that out and join in the celebration. I think they're also going to be calling into our show at the very end. But definitely wanted to make a shout out to that. So, I guess back to our conversation, literacy and language. You wanted to get into the idea of language acquisition versus language learning. And when you brought that up, I didn't actually know what the difference was. Would you mind explaining that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So acquisition is what generally happens most often with children. It's their absorbing their first language or languages. I'm going to say first language, but I recognize that many children are raised multilingually and might acquire languages at the same time. So like for me, that was English, which was my first language or is my first language. And that is done unconsciously or subconsciously, I suppose. There's less attention to structure, rather it's attached to meaning. So if your family's not like Mary's family, then probably you were exposed to language that was tied to meaning and not to form. By form, I mean grammar. So when my students, like I mentioned before, I teach middle school, 6th through 8th grade German, and sometimes I mention to them, you know, you want to have a balance of, or I try anyway in my classroom for a balance of exposure to comprehensible language that can help students acquire it. But I do a little bit of meta-linguistic thinking also, like finding roots and cognates and things like that. But I joke with them, I'm like, okay, remember when you were a baby, your parent probably didn't come to you or your guardian didn't come to you and say, okay, time for your first verb book, your first verb chart, you know, give you a dry erase chart. So acquisition is not based on form. And it does actually have a natural order.
Really?
Yeah, there's research on that. I'm not going to get into it because I don't know it off the top of my head. But there is a natural order for structure. So in what order children, for example, definitely not learning, acquiring English, what language features will they be able to use correctly? And like thinking about past tense, for example, as children, here's an example I can give. As children who are first language or native language English speakers are learning to express themselves in the past, they'll learn the irregulars pretty fast, like made, and then they'll figure out that there's a rule. No one tells them there's a rule to add ed in the past, and they'll say stuff then like mated, so they'll overcorrect. And there's an order for that. Learning, on the other hand, is conscious and it's structured usually. Often it's not aligned with the natural order of acquisition. So teachers might wait years before showing their students or exposing them to the past tense.
But that usually would be something that would be learned early on, or not learned, but acquired.
Exactly. Like think about toddlers. They have things that happen in the past also. I mean, they might not have it as an abstract of a comprehension of time or linear time, but they still need to say, like, I dropped it, not I'm dropping it right now.
Yeah.
For example.
Although I guess in their context, is there, maybe this is a question you can't answer, but I'm just wondering if having things in the infinitive is one of those steps where you just say the present tense all the time, like I drop it, or like I drop it yesterday, or I drop it.
Yeah. Yeah, probably.
Just out of. That
sounds intuitively reasonable to me.
I'll have to look into that more.
So, right. I wanted to make this distinction between acquisition and learning when I think about literacy and how literacy skills are being developed in sometimes foreign language or world language classrooms, and then also to think about literacy in schools in general and how that ties to privilege.
And that is something in your area of expertise. As we've mentioned, you are a German teacher and you've worked in a couple of different kinds of schools as well,
right?
Both in the US and in Germany.
Yes. So. Yeah, that's true. So traditionally, any listeners who maybe have learned a language in the past 30 years, if I can say, I'm not 30 yet, so, but just based on the research that I read, probably even before that, you might remember your classroom being very grammar focused.
I think even mine in the last, 15 years.
Yeah, so in the past, in grammar-based teaching, like think about students learning Latin. They weren't learning Latin to communicate with all the people who speak Latin nowadays.
The dead language that is Latin.
But it's reading comprehension and it's grammar-based, and so getting like a grammar rule, okay, today we're going to learn this, and then drilling it over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. To me, that doesn't really seem to be literacy developing.
What is that to you? When you're learning grammar sort of on its own or for its own sake. I think of Latin, or when I think of Latin learning, it's usually as a way to understand living languages or as a way to translate old documentation.
Yeah, so the example that you just gave of using it to understand living languages is an example of metalinguistic knowledge. That's knowledge that you know about a language, not your proficiency or your capability to express yourself in that language. And that's actually something to go into, I think, in more detail in a moment about like what does it mean to be literate in a language? That's a big question, but
that is a very big question
for language learners. So right now I just want to say two things about second language acquisition theory and how it's affecting classrooms, and particularly related to literacy. Mm-hmm. So two waves I'm seeing in the communities of teachers that I'm in is of world language teachers, I mean. And a quick note on foreign versus world language versus whatever other term teachers or schools might use. Foreign language, I think, kind of inherently has this overlaying thought that the languages are not ours.
Just having the title foreign language, which I've noticed that you're using like first language and second language instead of saying foreign language. Is there?
Yeah.
I don't know if you do that intentionally.
I do, yeah. But I also think it comes from my setting. So I teach German in a suburb of Philadelphia, and I do have a handful of students who come from German-speaking backgrounds. Their parents maybe are German, their grandparents are German, but for most of them, it's not like a language that they use in context daily. So in some ways, it is a foreign language. It's a language spoken by other people, but I think that creates a distance implicitly.
And I think that was your experience learning German as well. It was as a completely kind of randomly chosen thing, just because you...
it was intentional, but in some ways it was arbitrary, like most decisions.
Yeah, true.
Okay, so... So two ideas I want to plug, one of which is TPRS, so teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. So one wave that I'm seeing in the teaching circles that I'm in is teaching these languages from the beginning through the venue of stories, whether it's telling stories or having students eventually partake in the storytelling, giving their input, or whether it's reading. Students are encouraged to actually, or rather their teachers create the circumstance in which students can actually acquire the language.
Through those stories?
Right, because when parents are talking, or guardians, I'm going to say parent, but that could be any kind of person really, when the language speakers, I suppose, are speaking to children as they're developing their first language or first languages, they're doing it to tell a story or to share meaning that's meaningful, and not just to illustrate a structure. The structures come implicitly; they come along the way.
Yeah.
And actually, the other idea I wanted to plug is teaching through comprehensible input, capital C, capital I, which is intentionally speaking to students so that, firstly, in the target language, the language that you want them to acquire or learn, depending on your kind of classroom, such that they understand, which doesn't, like, that sentence period doesn't really sound radical, but it actually is.
Mm-hmm. You mean like meeting people at their level? I think that can be a radical idea.
Yeah, and very consciously doing that. Actually, it takes an extreme amount of knowledge of your students and ability to differentiate. And keep in mind, when you're looking out at this room of 20 individuals who are all acquiring the language at different levels, like, what questions can I ask this person? And there are tactics for doing that to make it understandable to them. But actually, so Stephen Krashen is one of the, if not the leading figures. He's a linguist and second language acquisition theorist and researcher, and he has many theories that have really affected language teaching and acquisition fostering, I suppose, in the last few decades. But one of the things that I've read about recently is that he advocates teachers being language parents to students in the classroom.
A language parent. So what does that mean, to be a language parent?
It means, doing what your parents would have done when they were exposing you, or whoever it was that was exposing you to language. Guiding you toward understanding without exposing you to structures too early, if I understand correctly.
So I'm thinking, trying to, like, as a teacher, instead of starting the first class with, like, this is how you say hello, and this is how you say this, and, like, past tense, and just going into that immediately, maybe starting with not even speaking in your first language, but automatically speaking in the target language, but it is simplified way? Yeah,
I mean, with meaning. So on the first day of class, introducing all the students to yourself, to all the students, and to each other in a way that is meaningful, that they understand it also. I think part of being a language parent is recognizing that you're responsible for the language that the students are exposed to and doing it intentionally. So, like, monitoring what output I am producing and what input the learners are receiving.
I'm trying to think of ways that one would do that in the classroom. Like, I think one way that you mentioned is through stories earlier, like reading stories that would be at an appropriate level. Or I guess just the example of coming into the classroom and introducing, so you're automatically using the target language and making it so that the students are able to get what you mean. Maybe they won't get it the first or second or third time, but by the fourth introduction, they might be like, oh, they're introducing themselves. And that's what it sounds like, and that's what it looks like.
I think it also entails a bit of fostering certain kinds of habits and openness. Like, one of the classroom conditions that I often see teachers using is telling students, okay, here are your expectations in this classroom, and one of them is listen with the intent to understand. Don't say anything or do anything necessarily, but listen with the intent to understand. And I tell my students that sometimes takes a bit of flexibility and bravery to really too. Because when you don't understand what's happening around you, even if it's something as simple as introductions, it's easy to check out.
Yeah, I mean, I remember specific instances in Germany where it would just be like, I was at a dinner party or something and there was so much conversation, and so, like, I'd be listening for the first 45 minutes or something, and then I would just get too tired and I would just stop completely, and I would just, like, kind of sink into my own thoughts and only engage if someone spoke directly to me, because it's exhausting and it's difficult.
Right. One thing that comprehensible input teaching focuses on, from what I'm currently researching, this is actually something that I'm dabbling in. I'm finding that a lot of things that I did intuitively in the classroom are supported by
that's great.
Some research, and not just some research, but really quality research. And official practices. So that's kind of nice for me to know, okay, there's backing to what I'm doing. And not just, well, I think, as a teacher, we rely on intuition a lot. Data, there's this push for data, but I can understand, I know where my students are because I'm talking to them all the time.
That's also, that alone is important and radical, is that you are talking to them and from that recognizing where they are.
And connecting it to what their interests are and what their lives are. In the beginning of class, I'll just chat with them in German sometimes, and sometimes they respond in English, but they're still understanding my questions and responding.
Yeah.
And actually, so one of the things I was about to say was that a lot of comprehensible input-based teachers will allow their students to have a silent period where they don't have to say anything in the target language yet, just listen and understand, and allowing, which is, what children do too. Children don't start speaking immediately. That would be terrifying.
Come out of the womb and, hey,
oh my gosh,
how's it going?
So, allowing for repeated exposure in context, which implicitly advances your language. You acquire way more vocabulary by reading and by hearing it over and over and over again in these stories or in these conversations, and personalizing it too.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, do you know, when you're talking about that silent period, would it be like part of each lesson, or would it be days or weeks long where they're kind of just absorbing?
So what I understand,
just trying to,
the silent period to allow, and again, this is something I'm still reading about, so forgive me if I'm a little off, is that, for example, at the beginning, say in this context of doing introductions, that you spend the class period I would go around, I would ask the students their names. I wouldn't make them say, like, my name is in German. I would just have them say their name. And then I would say, like, class, this is so-and-so, yes or no, and have them give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Okay.
And then at the end, maybe, when we have all this information, we might do a guided writing together, where I would model the writing. I would ask them questions. They would give their input without speaking, unless they feel ready to speak. And then they would write with me as it happens. So they're still engaging with the language and still comprehending it and everything. It's just, I'm not forcing them to speak it. Whereas sometimes right from the get-go, you're forced to say all these sentences, which can be really anxiety-provoking.
Yeah, I guess I was just trying to picture how that would be. I mean, having also taught in a second language classroom in Germany, I definitely was the kind of person who made all of my students talk every single class. And it was usually just in the context of, I would ask, a question at the beginning of class and have each person choose, and maybe that wasn't the best way of going about it, but it was usually pretty simple. I
mean, I also, to be fair, have all of my students say something each class period, whether it's a word or not. But I think that also comes from knowing who is in your classroom. I mean, that works in my classroom. And in general, my students want to. My sixth graders, this is their first exposure to German. And when I ask a question, I mean, the hands fly up.
That's awesome.
They want to try to say it. And I have the privilege, certainly, of not, like, seeing a classroom of blank faces looking at me. I mean, they're very motivated, to their credit, which is awesome. And I think it's fun for them. At least it seems that way. But I think the idea of knowing who's in your classroom is very important in this context. One thing that we chatted about a bit in preparation for the show was access to
resources,
but also to language learning classrooms. Not all students certainly not all schools have world language programs, and not all students are allowed, whether by their schedules, having other needs, to participate in those classes. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So I know that you've talked about this a little bit, and one example of that specific thing I have is my father. And as I mentioned before, my dad is a librarian, or he recently retired from being a librarian. And when he was very small, his first language was actually French. He only spoke French until he was, I think, 3 or 4 years old, and he doesn't speak any now at all. And when he was in school, it was, in English. and his grades were really, really bad, like very bad.
In English? What?
In all of his subjects. My mom jokes that she had never seen so many F's on a report card when she met him. But he's a very intelligent person, and he absorbs a lot, and obviously like is actively interested in language and in learning. And he was never allowed to take a second language because his grades were too bad. And so the idea was that he had to focus on his other subjects first. That to me is also a question of prioritizing and like what our education system prefers or puts as a priority, which does not, based on a lot of things, including, for example, New York State getting rid of the foreign language regents but keeping all other subjects. It shows a lack of priority of foreign language. So when I think of students not being allowed to take a second language, it's usually related to not having good grades in other subjects.
So, sorry, I was thinking while you were talking, which is generally dangerous.
It's all right.
In terms of active listening. So, did you say your father had to take English language classes? Not language arts, but did he have to take remedial?
I don't know.
Okay.
Unfortunately. All I know is that he didn't do extremely well.
But he could talk in English.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So this is actually a really common issue for students who have other languages as their first language or languages that they in school don't have academic language.
What do you mean?
So academic language, students. So I remember reading studies of students who came from various countries as children, let's say from a Spanish-speaking country, and they're able to get along with like, let's think of elementary schoolers, let's say a second grader, or let's say a fourth grader.
Okay.
Comes to the U.S. from a Spanish-speaking country or from any country, really. I'm thinking Spanish because Spanish is the most commonly offered world language. If a school has one language,
US,
it probably, that's what I mean, has Spanish. Though I'd be interested to know if like French Canadian bordering schools, would they be more likely to have French?
You'd be surprised, but no. That was something growing up that I always was very adamant that I was going to learn French because I grew up on the border of Canada. We were bordering English-speaking Canada, to be fair, but we were only an hour from Montreal, an hour from Quebec and 2 hours from Montreal. But my school came very close to cutting the French program, in fact, because they didn't need it for state regulations. They only had to offer one language, and that language would have been Spanish. They still do have the French program, but there are many more students who take Spanish than French, even though we're very close, which to me is very interesting, but
certainly
it just kind of is how it is, I guess.
So your French reminds me, actually, I could illustrate academic language with an example that you already gave us, which was when you were studying as a high school student in Belgium, you could communicate in French probably just fine by this point with your friends.
Mostly.
That you made. Yeah.
I mean, at the beginning of the year, not extremely well, but by the,
But you were in regular content area classes. Like
yes.
You were learning, what did you learn? Biology? Chemistry? Did you have a science?
I did. I actually had, in my schedule, I had 3 sciences. So we took chemistry, biology, and physics. And I had never taken physics before.
Right.
I had also never failed a class before, and I certainly did that
and
year.
That exactly is the experience that a lot of English language learners, I think there's actually a different term that's used more commonly now. English language, something else. But English language learners have in the U.S. when they come to our schools. They have their academic language in whatever their L1 is, whether that's Spanish, whether that's, in your case, was English. But they don't have the academic language to be able to either understand what they're reading or formulate in writing what they're supposed to be saying or the knowledge that they're supposed to be showing. So I think there are 2 issues that come into play here. Firstly, one is when teachers have English language learners in their classrooms. I'm talking again about teachers in the U.S. in predominantly English-speaking schools. recognizing that these students can probably express themselves at grade level, probably in their native languages, but also recognizing that maybe they don't, depending on where the students come from. They might not have had schooling. Right. For example, when I taught in Germany, I worked in the German as a second language class, which had students from various backgrounds, most of whom, if not all of whom, actually had come to Germany as refugees. And I had multiple students who were not literate in their first language. They couldn't read or write.
Because they hadn't been to school?
Yeah. I had one student who was an older teenager, and he had not ever been to school before.
Wow. So that's quite a jump, too. And right. Just to think that you can still fully communicate, like you can speak, but not being able to read or write.
Right. So I think one of the things in terms of literacy and how it ties to privilege in education is in our regular content classes that are taught in English, recognizing that students come from different backgrounds of literacy. They have different reading levels. They have different cultures that prioritize different ways of expression.
By different ways of expression, do you mean speaking versus writing or reading, or?
Do you mean speaking as opposed to, or do you mean speaking in verse when you said verses?
As opposed to.
Oh, okay. Because like chanting or rhythmic ways of expression are also
that's true.
Something
that's
that,
true, yeah.
If you read about culturally responsive teaching or pedagogy, or having a culturally responsive classroom, part of that is, I mean, you're responding to the cultures and to the individuals you have in front of you in the classroom, and recognizing different ways of that students might express themselves.
In verses, for example. I would just like to jump in really quick and just remind our listeners that you are tuned into 100.9 WXIR in Rochester, New York. This is Evidence of Design, and today we're talking about literacy at the moment. Anyway, we're talking about literacy and privilege. So, like, what kinds of access can you have when you are literate, and what kinds of barriers do you come across when you struggle with reading and writing and communication in the common language around you?
Right. So I think teachers of all content areas have the responsibility to their students to make their content accessible. I mean, if I know that I have a student in my classroom who has a different language as their first language, or the language that they're more comfortable with, you know, you can pre-teach or give them material in their native language. You can offer them resources for that, but they're going to be able to express themselves eventually in English and understand what they're reading in English better if they have that background knowledge from their language that they can read in.
Yes.
For example, if they can read in that language.
Yeah.
But of course, having access to literacy in your first language is also not guaranteed.
Yeah, that's true. I guess, do you have any more thoughts on that specific thing?
My last thought was also access to language classrooms, which we mentioned, like world language classrooms, both whether the school has a program. World language classrooms are often cut if there's a budgeting issue, along with arts.
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, with the priorities.
And also what kind of gatekeeping is done to prevent certain students from being allowed to learn a second language, or a world language, I mean.
Yeah.
I know I've heard of programs just in conversations with teachers about students who maybe receive additional English language support, like they're native English speakers, but they receive learning support for reading specifically. Maybe they have a reading disability. Sometimes these students are kept from the world language classroom, which to me is, I mean, that's not fair.
Yeah. It also, I don't think it necessarily, obviously this is, I don't think it necessarily has any bearing on how you're going to perform in a second language. Like, maybe it would help you learn English better, actually, if you're able to see a language from a different standpoint and learn it as someone who can already speak, like seeing a language that you can't might give you a better understanding as to how English works.
Maybe.
It's possible. I don't know.
Or it might just make you feel
more confused.
Curious. But I mean, I think it can also open up your mind, and it can be fun. Like, I think people in school, I'm a middle school teacher, so middle school is sometimes not the most fun place to be. It's a really hard time to be a person and to be becoming a person.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I want my students to feel welcome and to enjoy being there. And I remember I was reading something online about some teacher reflection, a reflection that a teacher had their students do in their classroom. And again, they're one of these comprehensible input teachers that do a lot of communicating with their students and a lot of personalization. And I remember a student saying, in Spanish class, my teacher knows this about me. I have this nickname because they know I play this sport really well or something. Mm-hmm. My other teachers don't know that. Like, my Spanish teacher sees me and remembers these details and incorporates them. And I think that's really useful, for children to feel seen.
Yeah. Or to, in that case, be seen.
Right.
Not just feel it.
A little bit of a digression there, but
yeah.
I'm always, I love teaching middle school in particular. So anytime I can share those good feelings.
Yeah. And we're so glad you do, too. One more thing that I would be interested in touching on. This is an idea that I had that sort of was in the foundations of building the idea for the show, was lingua franca. This idea of a bridge language, quote unquote, which would be a language or dialect that's used to make communication possible between groups of people who don't share a native language. So it would often be a second language. I looked a little bit into the history. My first thought was, okay, French used to be used by royalty across Europe. So it was very obviously a bridge language and very obviously classist. Thinking about what language and privilege tie together, French was used, or Old Norman French was used starting in 1066. It was used throughout Europe because France was becoming such a superpower. However, by the time of the French Revolution, it was still not spoken by everyone in France. I think about 75% of French citizens didn't actually speak French as their first language.
What did they speak then?
There were a lot of different dialects.
Okay, so you mean they didn't speak this Norman
right
French? And
I think by that time it wasn't Norman French anymore, but it was maybe closer to what we know of French as today. But even this language that was used for diplomacy and used for writing treaties wasn't spoken by the common people. So there was a lack of access that the everyday French person wouldn't be able to understand legal terms or wouldn't be able to understand the aristocracy. And I think that is a move of power. And the reason I wanted to bring that in briefly is to think about the role of English in the world today. Obviously, you're a German teacher, but we've both had experience teaching English abroad, and we both are native English speakers. Right. And one thing that is interesting and maybe necessary to think about is what kind of privilege one has as a native English speaker in the world, and what kind of privilege you can attain by learning English or by speaking another language.
Yeah. When you mentioned what kind of privilege comes along with being a native English speaker, I was scrolling through social media yesterday and saw that someone, a contact that I have, was going to be spending time abroad in a language institute. And in one of the conversations, there were strangers that were having the conversation. I saw that someone was saying, that they valued learning languages, but they travel so much. Sometimes they travel to, I don't know, something like 5 countries in a month or something. And there's no time for that, but English is spoken everywhere and they can get around speaking English.
Quote unquote, English is spoken everywhere. I guess it depends on, if you're staying in big cities, then maybe, but if you want to actually communicate with people fully and not just get around, I think that's a big difference, and English won't get you all the way there. But I do think that is a very valid point that you bring up, is that there is a an idea that's shared by an astonishing number of people, that they don't need to learn a second language because English is spoken everywhere, or is used in so many contexts. It's used in business, but like I mentioned, it doesn't necessarily get you to the heart of people who live in a country. It doesn't allow you any access to that culture.
Do you think we could consider that cultural illiteracy then? That people who rely only on English, or maybe who only learn travelers' English. I'm thinking now of English learners.
Sure.
Who aren't able to have maybe really deep conversations. Or even English speakers who go to other countries and learn like their travel phrases to get around, but not any more information. Do you think that contributes to a kind of cultural illiteracy where people can, again, how I was talking about missing this academic language, are we missing a cultural expression language, or is it just that they're missing the deep expression that they would have had they acquired the language more or learned it more? And that then leads to a deficit of cultural information or being able to actually participate in exchange.
I am not sure. I mean, for one thing, I don't think there's anything wrong with someone learning just the basics of a language if that helps them get around. I do want to say that. But I think if you just learn the basics of a language and then think that is enough and that you don't have the curiosity to learn more, even if you never actually do it, I think you mentioned curiosity earlier, and I think that's a really important moment in language learning, is wanting to know more,
right,
or wanting to know, wanting to get to the people or into a culture, and not just stopping at like the signs for the bathroom,
right?
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I was just thinking also now of, I mentioned before, which students are kept out of language classrooms. I would also be interested in, by language classrooms, I mean world language classrooms.
Yes.
Which students are forced to learn a language and maybe don't want to. I mean, my instinct as a language teacher is to be like, no, be in the classroom anyway. Because I want, my goal for you is to find a way for it to broaden your mind.
Yeah.
Obviously in a way that's not torturous, but
naturally.
Yeah, who knows?
That is an interesting question, and I don't know, honestly, I don't know how I feel about it. I think that it is important to at least offer the opportunity, to at least offer students a place where they can explore, because I think if you never offer them that space, then they're not going to know whether it's there or not.
This is true.
Maybe they'll start in a foreign language classroom and be like, this is awful and I hate it and I never want to do this again. But if they've given themselves the opportunity to try, then I think that is still.
And if their teachers foster that.
Yes.
If the teachers.
Well, I think that is a big part
come
of
in with the attitude that, I mean, that's part of equitable teaching too, I think, is coming in with the perspective all students can learn a language. I have to make it possible for them to succeed or can acquire a language.
Or to, I don't know, to at least be curious about acquiring the language. I think actually a lot of what happens in the classroom, like you mentioned that your students personally seem to be really motivated. And that's really amazing.
Yeah.
But I think that probably some of it comes from